don't think you have to adjust it. Sharpness wins. In 1975, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 3379, which basically equated Zionism with racism. Now, I was born in 1975, therefore I was not aware of this resolution. But I was born into a family that would have taken that resolution very personally, a family that was entirely in support of Israel at all costs, a family that believed in Zionism, a family that preached Zionism. And this permeated my entire life, every aspect of my life. My education, I was at a Jewish school until I was in 8th grade, my summer camp experience, my religious experience on weekends at synagogue, all permeated by one single, unvarying message that Israel was the greatest thing ever to happen to the Jewish people, because the Jewish people have been oppressed forever, historically, and now we had our own state in which we could be finally safe. This was the most important thing, and it also promulgated, this message also promulgated the idea that Israel was born out of the ashes of the Holocaust, which is an extremely dangerous ahistorical argument to make. But this was the message that I received on all fronts, and it, to the complete and total erasure of any other story. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I did not learn that Palestine was a place or that Palestinians were people until much later in my life. And I had to fight against the lies, specific lies, deliberate lies, very well woven lies, almost like it was like a conspiracy, to indoctrinate me, to give me the sense that there is no other narrative here, and therefore my thinking would be single-minded. But somehow, some way, I overcame this by educating myself. And some of the things that I learned over time as I began to finally open my mind and realize that there was another narrative here were infuriating, unsettling, disturbing, made me very sad. But I realized it was completely necessary to take this step. And the next step, of course, would be to start speaking the message out loud. And so as a teacher, I began to do that in my history classes in the various places where I've taught around this country. And that's not the easiest thing to do, especially when you're teaching or speaking to an audience of students who have that single-minded narrative in their heads. And some of the perspectives or some of the questions that I was asking were very dangerous and sort of got me into hot water from time to time. And sometimes I even asked myself, am I doing the right thing? I was sort of overcome by waves of self-doubt. Is this the right message to be sending? Should I be even doing this as a teacher? Should I be unsettling these people who have had these generations of ideas planted in their heads and they're so safe with them, they're so settled with them? Is it really my right to upset their little nice stories? Is it my right to do that? And on occasion, I really was overcome by some serious self-doubt in that way, and second-guessed myself. But what I've realized is, when you begin to dig deep into a student's sense of justice, even the most, I would say, deeply committed Zionist kids, whose parents had taught them the same lessons that I taught, began to hear something that sort of began to move them. And it was a simple question that I asked them. I said, do you think that the Palestinian narrative has some weight too? That's all I asked. I didn't ask who's right. I didn't ask whose land it was. I didn't ask for a history lesson or give them a history lesson. I just asked, does somebody else's story have merit, even though it's their story and not yours? And that was the question that kind of like began to move some machines, and I got fired. But the key here is that students began to hear the message, and they had to do things with it. And I have had students who have gone on to do some incredible social justice work, and really fight for the Palestinian cause and putting themselves out there in a way that is dangerous to them, and they get a lot of hate mail. But they're out there doing this work because they too heard the clarion call for justice, and decided to be very brave and move forward. So I mentioned the idea of Zionism being racism. So I want to ask you a question. Is Zionism really a racist ideology? This is an important question. It was, I guess, decided upon by the UN in 1975, but it remains one of those questions, and it causes a lot of strife and a lot of upset. I would like to say that Zionism is over 130 years old, and like most Jewish philosophies, has a lot of strains and a lot of different denominations, and people argue about it nonstop. So it's not one thing. But Zionism in the form of the empire of the State of Israel is indeed racist. And in fact, I would argue that it's Jewish supremacist. Now, if my grandmother heard me say that, she's been dead 10 years. But if she heard me say that, she would be totally and completely confused and confounded. And she would want to send me right back to Hebrew school. Jewish supremacy, what kind of thing is that? And the truth is, it is a thing. It's a word that we're using more and more often now, and people are feeling a little more comfortable about saying white supremacy. So we've got to equate where the equations are. We've got to fill in the gaps. And so what Israel does is, in a lot of ways, what you've heard this evening, is it practices Jewish supremacy. And that is indeed racist. What's truly important here is to recognize the difference between, so that's what Zionism is. And I, because I am against that sort of thing, am an anti-Zionist. Now, it's very important to recognize that there's a difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. This is really, really key. Because a lot of times, people who are critical of Israel are labeled very easily, very quickly, anti-Semites, and then you can just do away with them. They're an anti-Semite. They're just as bad as Goebbels or Hitler. And you can set them aside and not worry about what they have to say. It's easy to silence people that way. But we need to be very careful. And we need to understand that there's a very subtle, not so subtle, a very important difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And it comes down to power. Zionism is something that is perpetuated with power. It is the Jewish state of Israel that has the power and oppresses Palestinians. And that's why Zionism right now, mainstream political Zionism, is racist, because it possesses the power. Anti-Semitism turns that on its head. If you are the victim of anti-Semitism, it is because the power is being directed at you in a negative way to harm you. So we have to come to terms with this. Jews have to come to terms with this. Yes, okay, for 2,000 years, the Romans, the Spanish, everybody, they were all on your case, on my case, my ancestors' case. It's been ugly, it's been bad, but now the table has turned, and you need to understand that in a position of power, of course, that comes with responsibility, and you actually need to start to enact that responsibility. You can't just use power without any sense of what's right. You can't just use power willy-nilly. And that's what Israel has been doing, and that's what its supporters and its apologists have been doing. And so that's an important key difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So the propaganda machine has worked very well to implant these lies in people's minds. And if you're coming to the recognition that the propaganda machine is out there and it's sucked you in, and you're ashamed of that, don't be. Because all of us at some point in time have been sucked in by the propaganda machine. If not for this issue, then another. So you got to recognize that the minute you open your eyes, that's your rebirth in a sense. And the minute you begin to mine for the truth, you're on your way. And it doesn't matter how much time you spent being sucked in by the propaganda and the lies. The machine is very strong. It's very powerful. It has a lot of money and power behind it. So if you wake up today and you recognize that you've been part of this machine and you want out, that's good. Set yourself apart from the past. But the movement is going, and it's not stopping. It's going very fast, and it's not going to wait for people. So get on board, because it really is very close to being too late. Thank you.